Now, to begin this session, which will be basically reports, we're going to have the first report from Gavin. He's the Secretary General of UPF in the United States. He has worked in the United States in the fields of public affairs, political outreach for more than 30 years. This evening, he's going to report to us about developments in the ongoing fight for religious freedom for the Unification Church and other religions in Japan, including recent breakthroughs with the United States Congress and State Department. Please join me in welcoming Gavin. Please.
Good evening, our honored colleagues, delegates, brothers and sisters. I'm going to shock you a little bit with what I'm about to tell you. Some of you may have heard about this, some of you may not have heard about this, but there's an incredible human rights abuse taking place in a very modern country and nation of Japan. I want to read you a couple of stories about what's happening. This is the case of Mr. Koide. On June 13th, 1992, Roshia Koide, a medical doctor, was kidnapped while he was busy taking care of his many patients at a hospital. He was confined for almost 2 years. He was imprisoned for 2 years. During his confinement, Hiroshi, a lawyer, visited the confinement place. Despite the obvious criminal violations he witnessed, Hirata told Koide's parents and relatives the confinement was legal. Consequently, Koide's period of confinement was prolonged. After 1 year in confinement, Mr. Ariata, a reporter notorious for criticizing the Unification Church of Japan, came to Koide's place of confinement. In his report about Koide, even though he was aware Koide was being held against his will, he conveniently excluded this information in his story. One of the deprogrammers who visited Koide in the confinement place was Minister Yasutomo Matsunaga. Matsunaga holds lectures where he demonizes the Unification Church and frightens parents to take their sons and daughters, kidnap them, and take them out of the church. He holds 2-day seminars. He teaches kidnapping and confinement techniques. Koide describes his experience in a book that he wrote, Escape from My Kidnappers. This is him. He's a medical doctor. He was kidnapped and held against his will for over 2 years. This is the first case that went to the Supreme Court. The first faith-breaking court case that went to Japan's Supreme Court is a case involving Mrs. Ishikawa. Mrs. Ishikawa had been confined in private apartments in 1996 and again in 1998 for periods of 52 days and 70 days respectively, held against her will, imprisoned. The parents had read a book by Mr. Kawasaki and consulted with Unification Church deprogrammers. When she was kidnapped, she jumped out the window to escape. Subsequently, she and her husband filed a civil lawsuit in the Tokyo District Court against her parents in Shimizu. She demanded compensation from the minister who kidnapped her and a court injunction for every defendant as a safeguard. Again, her case was thrown out of court. This is going to shock you. This is a case of rape. Although her real name cannot be used, a female member of the Unification Church was raped by a professional faith breaker during her detention. Her story is told under the pseudonym Mrs. Keiko Itakawa in the book Our Unpleasant Neighbor. Tragedy of a female believer who was rescued from the Unification Church, and written by the investigative reporter, Mr. Yonemoto. After about 30 years ago, when Keiko was a college student, she was kidnapped by her father and confined to a correctional facility operated by faith breakers. 36 days later, she was forced to send notification of her resignation from the Unification Church. The faith breaker moved her into his own apartment where he confined her for 65 days and raped her more times than she could count. Finally, she escaped from the apartment and charged him with abduction, confinement, and rape. The case was investigated by the police and prosecutors. Fearful that her case would be made public, she dropped the charges. I could go on and on and on. Over 4,300 members of the Unification Church have been kidnapped, held against their will during the last 40 years. This is a crime that is going unpunished. In the United States, we're taking action against it. We are protesting at Japanese consulates and trying to pressure the Japanese government to enforce its own laws. They have laws against kidnapping. They have laws against holding people against their will. But the Japanese government does not enforce their own laws. Religious freedom does not exist for all people in Japan. So we try to bring this to the Japanese consulates in Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles, Miami, New York, Portland, San Francisco, and Seattle. These are the states that we went to. We held demonstrations. We had letters that we wanted to deliver to the consulate. In New York, we had delivered a letter to the consulate. They refused to meet with any representatives of the Unification Church. So we went back and we demonstrated against them, brought the media out, and brought the shame of what the Japanese consulate was doing and not even listening to members of the Unification Church. We brought the Executive Vice President of the Unification Church, Joshua Cotter, out. We brought one of our victims, Mr. Luke Higuchi, and another victim who told about her terrible situation where she was held against her will. She could barely talk about it. She was so emotional. She can't even go back to her family in Japan because she doesn't trust that they won't kidnap her again. Because nothing is being done to stop this crime from taking place in Japan. This is an incredible human rights violation taking place today in Japan. In Seattle, we held rallies at the Japanese consulate. In Los Angeles, we did it again. We had rallies. We attempted to deliver a letter to the Japanese consulate. A member of the State Department from the United States met us out in front of the building and said the consulate does not want you to enter their building. We were forced to send a certified letter. They still have refused to meet with us. The Japanese government considers this a family matter, even though people are being kidnapped, people are being held against their will, people are being confined, sometimes for months, sometimes years. Some people have even been raped. This is Toro Goto. This young man was kidnapped when he was 31 years old. He was confined for 12 and a half years. He was 44 years old when he finally was released. His parents and the kidnappers felt that they could not break his faith. So after 12 and a half years, he was thrown out onto the street in Japan. The second person he met was a Unification Church member. She brought him to the church headquarters. He was later brought to a hospital where he recovered. He's now speaking out all over Japan and all over the world to rally people to wake up the Japanese government to enforce its own law and to stop this human rights event from taking place anymore. This is in Seattle. Hundreds of people gathered together to be educated by Mr. Krishnik, Mr. Higuchi, and these kinds of events are taking place all over the United States. We're visiting the media. We're visiting members of Congress. This is my congressman. His name is Keith Ellison. He's standing right next to Reverend Injin Moon. Reverend Jenkins is in that picture on the far right-hand side there. And our Women's Federation for World Peace representative is right next to Reverend Injin Moon. Now, this congressman is a Muslim. He's the first Muslim that was ever elected in the United States Congress. He heard about this. He was so shocked, he immediately contacted the Japanese embassy. the Japanese embassy refused to respond. They said this is a family matter, they're not getting involved. This is Danny Davis, another congressman from Illinois. He'd been contacted, he's written letters to Japanese parliament members, he's written letters to the Japanese consulate, he's written letters to the Japanese embassy, and again, the Japanese embassy and the Japanese government refused to hear the complaints of the United States congressman. Isn't this amazing? This is modern day Japan, one of the biggest modern countries in our world, is refusing to uphold human rights for all people in their nation. This is the State Department. We've met with the State Department on many occasions on this issue. And Mr. McLaren, who's pictured here in this picture, he went to Japan, he investigated it, he came back and made a report that there was, in fact, he told us personally that he met victims, he realizes that there is a crime taking place, and Mr. Peter Kovach was briefed Congressman McGovern, Congressman Wolf, and the Lantos Human Rights Commission, and the awareness is increasing in America that there is a huge human rights violation taking place in Korea. The State Department is looking into it, members of Congress are looking into it, and it's becoming more and more evident that the Japanese government is doing something to cover up a crime that's taking place against its citizens and doing nothing about it. We're going to continue to mount pressure. This is Congressman Randy Forbes from the state of Virginia. Again, when he heard about this, he said, what can I do? American congressmen are shocked that Japan will continue to let this crime be committed in its nation. It needs outside pressure. Let me tell you a story. There's a story about wife beating, spousal abuse taking place in Japan. This took place continually over decades. You could beat your wife, you could rape your wife, and they considered it a family matter. They would not prosecute anybody for that crime. Finally, outside groups, people like you from your country, people like me from my country, began to protest to the Japanese government. And we asked the Japanese government to prosecute wife beaters, to prosecute people who abuse their spouses. And you know, finally, the Japanese government admitted it was no longer a family matter. They began to put people in prison if they beat their wife, if there was spousal abuse. That's the only thing we can do to wake up Japan. Japan has to be embarrassed. They have to hear from you. They have to hear from me. They have to hear from all of us that we will no longer permit this atrocity to take place, for people to be kidnapped, held against their will, and for these things to continue. This is Reverend In-Chin Moon meeting with members of Congress, meeting with the governor from New Mexico, and again, she's telling them the same story over and over again. She always gives them a gift when she leaves. She gives her father's autobiography. I want to wrap up right now and just say that there are some things that we're going to be doing in the future. Every state in the United States will be holding rallies in 2011. Every state will be meeting their local media. We want to begin an outcry that will reach the halls of Congress and the Parliament in Japan, the Prime Minister of Japan, the Foreign Minister of Japan, the Justice Minister of Japan. We want in America to have our voice so loud that they will not be able to close their ears anymore. We're planning a fact-finding tour in the month of April or May. We'll be bringing over members of Congress, former members of Congress, former governors and senators, and we will be confronting the Japanese government and asking them when they're going to finally enforce their own laws and have religious freedom in their own country. Aaron Rhodes, who is the executive director of the Helsinki Commission, he's retired from that now, but he is beginning a report on this issue that will be released to the United Nations. We are looking for congressional hearings on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and we want to continue to mount the pressure. Everybody has a petition in front of them. Could you hold your petition up? Okay. If you would take that petition right now and sign it, put your name on it, put your title on it, and put the date on it, we will deliver these petitions to the Japanese government and to members of the United States Congress. So if you could do that now, please sign it, and we'll be getting these in continue to let the Japanese government know that they cannot any longer continue this crime in their country of Japan. But that is it. Please, delegates, take this seriously. We'd like to encourage you to go back to your countries. In your countries, contact your Japanese consulate. Tell them that you heard about this at the Universal Peace Federation conference, and we will give you materials to go to your Japanese consulate and ask them to take action. If enough nations of the world stand up against this human rights abuse in Japan, we will get their attention, we will get this crime stopped, and we will get religious freedom for all people in Japan. Thank you very much.